I thought I'd start perhaps by discussing the role in the UNDP, and maybe if you're able to provide some context for us, you know, what were the responsibilities in that role and what were the challenges that you faced?
I went up to New York to lead UNDP in April 2009, and I'd just come off 9 years as Prime Minister, where obviously you get a lot of support. In a country like New Zealand, you have the whole apparatus of the government system working with you, and great staffing that you built up over the years. So you start again with an international organisation. You walk in, you don't know it, you don't know the people. But you over time put a team together as some retire, others come that you have a chance to. It was very different in a way from being Prime Minister, because as Prime Minister you're leading a government, you have the power to do things, you have a majority in Parliament, you have executive power. Leading a UN organisation, yes, you have executive power over the organisation, but obviously not over countries, because your job is to advise and support countries to meet their national development aspirations. So, of course, the best advice can go sitting on shelves and not be picked up. But generally, developing countries were looking for ideas, looking to build skills, looking to have good strategies to meet their own national and be up with and achieving the global goals and agendas. So it was a fascinating job, different from leading a country, but nonetheless very rewarding.
That sort of challenge that you outline of not being in direct control of things, not being able to direct activity, make things happen through lines of command, if you like. Very similar role to an Auditor-General, who I think some people call me the Reporter-General. You can write a report, you can do what you can to influence people's uptake on it, but really a difficult job if people are resistant. What are some of the sort of tools that you might have used in that United Nations role to help people sort of come on board with the programs or the changes that you were looking to implement?
So it very much depended on the political system and the context. Of course, one of the challenges is that you're working with the member states of the United Nations, and they go all the way from the Western-style democracies to the most authoritarian countries on earth. The Western-style democracies you depended on for your baseline funding and a lot of the program and project funding of the organisation. So it was very important to maintain a close relationship with the high-income countries. Then you had other high-income countries that are not Western democracies, like the monarchies in the Gulf, and you would also retain a liaison with them, because they are also significant funders of many UN organisations. Then you had the over 177 developing countries. We used to refer to having territories where we had programs. And as I say, they went from those, take Uruguay in South America, which very much models itself on New Zealand. It has democratic government, but you're going all the way to the most fragile states on earth, like the Central African Republic and Somalia, and some of the most authoritarian on earth, from Belarus and also China, very, very authoritarian. So you had to have ways of working which enabled you at UNDP to have an impact regardless of the political system, which isn't so easy. So you relied a lot on your national staff and then on the international staff that went into country offices, and there were usually two international staff, the resident representative and the deputy. They had to be very sensitive to the local political context, because it's very easy to be declared persona non grata from a country that doesn't like being lectured to or doesn't like your efforts. So it was a question of finding the entry points. Now, if you take the Pacific and the development challenges it faces, clearly climate change is an overarching existential issue. And the Pacific, the Caribbean states, the Indian Ocean states, Cape Verde and the Atlantic Ocean, they are really looking for partnerships on helping access the money from the Global Environment Fund, from the Green Climate Fund. They're looking for ideas, policies, technologies. I mean, these are the most willing partners you can get, right? And absolutely a joy to live with. And so at the UN, there would be groupings like AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. And UNDP and others would work with them to ensure that the Pacific and other small island voices could be heard at the big conferences, the annual climate change conferences, other conferences too. One of the issues we took up in my time with the Pacific, Caribbean, Indian Ocean was the issue of a number of the countries moving into middle income status, and therefore away from the more concessional lending terms of the international financial institutions. But the problem is the small island state has inherent vulnerabilities, and they're related to the weather and also to climate change. But just the normal year will bring its hurricanes, its typhoons, and its potential for disaster. And this wasn't really taken into account by the international financial institutions. If you're a middle-income state, you're a middle-income state. But we argued for years with the regional organizations of the small island states for a vulnerability weighting so that regardless of whether you were Vanuatu or middle income, if something like Cyclone Pam comes along, you need help. You're already probably mortgaged to the hilt with your own lending. So to be able to borrow at non-concessional rates to repair the damage is very, very difficult indeed. So there were those kinds of issues that we would work closely with the Pacific and others on. And I'm happy to say that on the latter one, we did have support from the OECD Development Assistance, Eric Solheim. He was terribly sympathetic. So I would go off to the meetings on the side of the World Bank, IMF, spring and autumn meetings, and make the case on these issues like vulnerability weightings for the most vulnerable countries.
I think in our last Congress, it was in Fiji, and there was a speaker who said the Pacific's either in a crisis or recovering from one. There is that sort of vulnerability to all those nations in the Pacific, including New Zealand's had its share as well at various times, but obviously the income level's different. That sort of challenge of working across different, if you like, parliamentary and democracy through to quite austere and unresponsive regimes. It's not to say that Pacific nations are like that, but it is a real challenge for all of us in leadership roles where we're looking to make change happen. And I guess you were talking about how you tune into an economy, tune into a country, and how you sort of think about how you influence in those situations. And the New Zealand Auditor-General is in a very fortunate position. It's got a very strong constitutional support and legislative support for us, but not everybody's in that position. And I guess some of the techniques as a leader that you took to bear in trying to make change in some of those countries, obviously you had some infrastructure to support you, but without naming names, what were some of the tools and techniques that you took on as a leader to make change happen?
Well, firstly, UNDP had a mandate to promote democratic governance and good governance and strong institutions and accountability and transparency. And of course, in that range of issues, Auditor-General's offices are going to loom very, very large as absolutely vital integrity and accountability institutions. So in our programming around the world, we would have had support for such institutions. Now, I'm aware that there are a range of different kinds of approaches to audit offices. Some are quite narrowly focused on the government accounts, but others have more expansive roles where they can undertake their own inquiries, and that can be incredibly useful. But I'm also aware that in very small countries, in the small island developing states, these are small societies, and it can take a lot of courage to stand up and on government in small societies, actually in large societies as well, frankly. So Auditor Generals need a lot of courage. They need good legislation backing their office and their independence. They should never be able to be arbitrarily dismissed because the government didn't like a report. So our work was always geared at supporting institutional strengthening, because without these institutions of transparency and accountability, what have you got? Well, kleptocracy can reign, unfortunately. And one of the checks on kleptocracy is a strong Auditor General's office. I might say I saw very impressive Auditor General's offices in the widest range of countries. Now, one we mentioned, a Commonwealth country, Tanzania. Tanzania has its ups and downs with governance, but the General's office has been well respected. And I came to know the Auditor General of Tanzania because in the auditing of UN organisations, there is a board of auditors, and it has 3 countries on them. And each country on the audited board for the UN picks the organisations, or is allocated organisations to audit. So Tanzania was allocated UNDP, and the Auditor General from Tanzania would visit me from time to time. I visited him in his offices in Dar es Salaam, but I had great respect for him and the job that he did, and he could say some tough things and actually had respect. Now I thought, that was pretty good given the political context. So I see him as really a role model of what an Auditor General can be in a low-income country with many, many challenges.
Yes, I think that's a point very well made. I think sometimes I hold my breath before I issue a report, thinking that's going to be a bit tricky. But I feel protected in my role. Whereas I think even in the audience today, there's various vulnerabilities for people that want to really confront government transparency or accountability issues. And I think we often reflect here on the bravery of some of those reports where they really do call things to account. So thank you for that. I think that's a very supportive comment.
And also let's remember that there are societies where life is cheap and it's easy to take people out with hired killers. So fearless officers of the state are also putting their lives on the line often, and we should salute the courage of those who do their job and speak out in very tough circumstances like that.
Yeah, no, that's a very somber point, but well made. Yeah. In terms of reflecting back on your time at the UN and the work that you did there, have you got a story or an anecdote of some area of change where you feel that the organisation really did move a government or move a debate somewhere that was quite, done through influence, if you like, rather than direction or immediate funding? You were able to sort of bring to bear influence and how you went about that leadership of that change, because I think we all struggle sometimes about how best to influence change in a country, and certainly the role of the UN would be one where you would have struggled, I'm sure, with various issues you wanted to bring to bear. So if there is one to share with us, and we're welcoming comments or questions from the audience as well, so they might have some thoughts about that.
Well, look, I can think of a lot of stories, but let me tell one about Belarus, which is a very difficult country. But UNDP's been there all along, and it's, by the way, Belarus is in a particularly bad space at the moment, much worse than when I was UNDP administrator and visited there. So when I visited, there were a couple of things that really impressed me about the niche that UNDP had carved out. One of them was that we were the fund holder for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Now, that was set up to channel resources directly to governments to pay for antiretroviral drugs, prevention programs in HIV, deal with TB, which is still a significant issue in parts of the world. Malaria, not in Belarus, it's far too cold, but TB and HIV were big. Now, Belarus has been very much in what was the Soviet orbit and remains the Russian orbit to this day. And in Russia and much of its former Soviet Union neighborhood, they are very against harm reduction measures for HIV and for people who use drugs. And that means that injecting drug users are very vulnerable to passing or transmitting HIV, other diseases that can be transmitted by needle, because there's no needle exchange programs and there's very little opioid substitution therapy. Now, UNDP was able to get alongside the Minister of Health in Belarus. He was an old doctor, and he knew that harm reduction was needed. And he, through UNDP, accepted that they should go down the route of opioid substitution treatment. And when I went to Belarus, I went with this minister to a treatment centre where I met people who were on the opioid substitution therapy, something we'd often call methadone maintenance in New Zealand. And I spoke to those people. They were the same stories that I would have heard from people sitting in such a clinic in New Zealand. People who said their lives had fallen apart, they'd moved to drugs, they were not safely injecting, and that for them, this program was an absolute lifesaver. Now, to think that that could happen in Belarus when Russia didn't like it, the rest of the former Soviet sphere was, in general, not supportive at all. It was quite remarkable, and I put it down to the long-term relationship building that UNDP had done. Also on one of those visits, I met with a range of civil society groups. Also not so easy to be civil society in Belarus. But one of the things UNDP was often asked to do was with the reviews that went to the Human Rights Council, the peer review process. And New Zealand is peer reviewed every 4 to 5 years, all countries are. And it's expected that civil society will be able to have a say. Now, if you are a very authoritarian country and government, you're not used to talking to your civil society. So again, UNDP became the platform on which the civil society could meet and discuss and offer views into a report. That was all positive. As I say, the country has gone into a very, very bad space now, and whether these things are even possible at the moment is hard to know. But certainly I was encouraged when I was working on them there.
Mm. Yeah. No, they're really interesting observations. Building long-term relationships and momentum around change is a really difficult thing. Governments change. Well, in some countries, governments change. Other countries, they don't. But building that long-term trust and I think is a key influence that Auditors-General certainly try and do. I know, but also the sort of building civil society consensus around issues that can support the work that you're doing. I think that the long-term nature of some of the UN work is makes change over a long term. I'd perhaps change to tack a little bit and talk to the work you've just recently done for the World Health Organization on the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. I have to keep checking on that title. It's a good long one, but a very hard-hitting report. Actually, I'm not sure if others have had a chance to read it, and a very topical report. We have really highlighted some really systemic issues, the sorts of things Auditor-Generals really get interested in. And just acknowledging, of course, some people on the call are very much in the deep part of responding to a COVID outbreak or whatever across the Pacific as well, and so very relevant. So, at one level, we all look for long-term change on things that, might require legislation or other substantive change in parliaments. On the other hand, we also want sometimes things to happen very quickly, if we possibly can. And I wonder whether there's, from some of your roles, a frustration about speed sometimes, but perhaps turning first to that report, I'd be really interested for us to hear the background to your involvement in that and how that came together. And then what impact do you think we can have, that report might have in the short term as well as in the medium term? Obviously, I think a subtitle for it, I haven't written it down, but it's something like "Make this the last one" or something. I think was one of the "Make this the last pandemic." Yeah, it was a fantastic report. In fact, I'm going to use some of the phrase in the future. Make this the last time I have to say this. I'm not sure if that'll ever work, but be really interested in you just sort of talking around your role there, what the aspirations for change are, and how you see that playing out. Would be really interesting for us, I think.
Well, some of the media coverage I've seen of the report describes it as setting a new bar in accountability, and I think that's a word that Auditor-Generals very much relate. It's about accountability. And of course, when we were asked to do it, perhaps the World Health Assembly thought, well, let's look at how the WHO did. But our panel took the view, we can't look at how it did without looking at how the member states did. So we've held everybody to account, and comfortable or uncomfortable as that may be, we're all totally independent. None of us got paid on the panel, got paid a cent for doing it. It's all pro bono, so we're completely independent. And we can say what we like, but what we've said is based on the evidence that we gathered. And we did a very complete chronology of what was understood to have happened when. And it's from that chronology that we drew the conclusions that it was all far too slow from the time the virus appeared in Wuhan. Yes, the doctors in the hospital said, hello, there's a cluster of cases we haven't seen anything like before. They sent the samples off for testing. Good on them. They acted. Went to the municipal authorities, who declared about 10 days later, or got a notice out to their hospitals saying, this is what we're seeing happening. That was picked up by the World Health Organization and others who are constantly scanning the world for such notice. Then questions were sent to Beijing. The answers weren't so fast in coming. And I keep reminding people that we do live in the 21st century when a virus is on the next plane. We're not in the Middle Age where it travels on foot and by donkey. So hours, days, weeks obviously count. Despite Wuhan knowing that there was something very unusual here and having issued its bulletin on the 30th of January, it did not lock down until the 30th of December, the bulletin. It did not lock down until the 23rd of January, some 3 weeks later, after which countless tens of millions of people had travelled in China for the Lunar New Year. So it was out of the bag. It's starting to appear in Thailand and so on. So the World Health Organization, we do not say it failed. We say it operated in a system that was designed to fail. It has no right of access to the site of an outbreak. So it didn't get access to Wuhan for a while. It has no right to publish information it's receiving from countries without their permission. That's wrong. It's not empowered to act in a precautionary fashion, which we think is warranted when a respiratory pathogen is on the move. Look at this, where someone who had kind of passed by someone picked up the Delta variant of COVID. I mean, this is not an easily contained disease. So with a respiratory pathogen, you must act in a precautionary fashion and not have to do all the T crossing, I dotting, double checking that enables you to say, hello, we have a major problem here. And then it's a complete mystery to us why the emergency committee convened by the Director-General under the International Health Regulations did not declare the public, or did not recommend declaring the public health emergency of international concern on the 22nd of January. It finally did on the 30th of January when the Director-General went to China and presumably talked down the opposition there. But everything was too slow. And we've held people accountable for that, and we've made a range of suggestions about how things can be speeded up. Now, having said that, we then hold the member states accountable because, frankly, very few member states acted with the alacrity they should have done when the Director-General issues such an international declaration. And that's how the cat got out of the bag, then much more wider globally. By the time most countries, including our own, acted decisively in March, we had a raging pandemic, and it's never let up. We're going through accelerated waves all the time. So it's very, very difficult. How did I come to be involved? Well, I've always had a background working on health issues. From the time I was a backbencher, I was Minister of Health. As PM, I took a big interest. At UNDP, I kept my hand in health because we held, as I said before, the big funds for the Global Fund on AIDS, TB and malaria. When I left UNDP, to do things, but many of them came from the health sphere. I have known Dr. Tedros for quite a lot of years because he was Foreign Minister of Ethiopia. I interacted with him then. He rang me up and asked for ideas on who could lead the inquiry, so I gave him a few, and then he came back and said, I'd like you to do it. So it's a hospital pass, but someone's got to do it. So of course I agreed to help, and we're still friends after the report, by the way, but which is a bit tough on WHO, but it's tough on everybody.
Yeah, they've certainly had some rough water that they've been in for a while. In terms of it's a very compelling read. That report, it is very clear in what needs to be done. How do you feel? How does that influence the world now? How do you feel that change will happen or not?
Well, we are keeping on at it. My co-chair and I and some of the most active panelists, we continue to be active promoting it. And the chances are we'll continue to have a small budget to enable us to keep some key staff on and keep driving forward, because we need some international decisions, basically. Now, the World Health Assembly met in May. That's the world's health ministers. But you would have thought there wasn't a crisis. They don't move at the speed of lightning. So one of the key ideas is that there should be a new international convention that fills the gap in international law, is very clear about member state responsibilities, and sets out more clearly the norms and ethics around all of this. So the World Health Assembly decided to hold a meeting in 6 months' time to talk about it, not the speed of lightning. And they've set up an open working group to look at the proposals we've made and a couple of the other review bodies around, but none of it's quick. Then the G20 held a health summit that produced a declaration which was far too high level. The G7 was very focused on it, didn't come through with the resources required, but was supportive of some of our key ideas like the new global governance model. So the next step will be that we will do a briefing to the General Assembly before it goes into the summer recess in July. What we would like, and WHO is very much on board with this, is to have the member states agree that they need to have a high-level event later this year at the UN and to negotiate for that a political declaration around the reform program. That's how you get momentum globally on new institutions, architecture, and the direction of reform. The G20 has a high-level panel, which is also doing a report. We talk with them. There's another one, a pan-European one, which was mandated by the World Health Organization in Europe. Also very credible investigation. I'm actually tonight talking with people from each of those commissions, and we're looking at how our ideas can converge. Because if we, and you can think of this as Auditor Generals, if you give a government or governments 3 different sets of recommendations, then they'll play all off against the other for the lowest common denominator. So it will be best if we can get our reports all moving broadly in the same direction to make it easier for member states to see what the menu is and move with the consensus.
It's a really rich story you've told there, and also perhaps a level of frustration about how things move sometimes on a global stage. But in another way, I guess you could look at that and say it's quite quick movement relative to some other issues that this one's so much more present. But
just on that, I mean, back in 1986, there was the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which had spillover effects beyond national borders and sent a chill around the world, really, about unsafe old nuclear power plants. So I say that the COVID-19 pandemic is the Chernobyl moment in global health. Now, Chernobyl produced within 5 months 2 new conventions negotiated by the international community, greater powers for the International Atomic Energy Agency, and more information sharing and countries on nuclear safety than we'd ever seen before. And that was able to be achieved in the last days of the Cold War, when relations between the major powers were very strained. So actually, it's not unrealistic to be saying that within 6 months you should get good outcomes. Now, yeah, within 6 months we should have had a convention negotiated. Instead, they're going to talk about it in 6 months. So we have to continue to say this is urgent, because the way of the world is that at some point, heaven knows when, we will get out of the pandemic phase of this disease. And then everyone will go back thinking, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them over and over. We could have another dangerous pathogen emerge tomorrow. I doubt it'll be another 100 years. So we'd better be ready. We weren't ready for this one. We can be ready for the next one, but it's going to take some decisive moves at the and at the international level. And just a point relevant to Auditor-Generals on the national level, those of you who have the capacity to do broader ranging inquiries might want to consider looking at the state of preparedness and response in your own countries. I think that would be, these exercises need to be done. And if your officers have the capacity to do them, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I think certainly that's something on our agenda to look at, as well as how this response went, because there will always be learnings from that. As you talk, comes to mind the sort of challenge of making things happen that we know are going to happen, but actually making them urgent for people to prepare for. And probably a classic for that one must be climate change, as you know, it always appears to be going to happen to us in the future. Why should we pay for it now? But for the Pacific and some of those other nations you highlighted, it's very real right now. It is on top of us. I don't know, in terms of some of that experience with COVID and the work you did there, reflecting on where we're at with climate change in the Pacific and elsewhere, any observations about that sort of making long-term challenges much more present and current, and how nations could perhaps put more urgency into what they see as their long-term risks than sometimes we see?
Yes, actually, there's a new book out that I edited and did the foreword to, this Climate Aotearoa, which is by a range of New Zealanders with expertise looking at the issues for our country. And in the foreword, I looked at why has there been such a different response to COVID as a crisis as against the climate crisis. And of course, one is a slow-moving train wreck, the other came on as a kind of very fast train wreck in your face. And I think with climate change, it's a bit like the lobster that's put in cold water and the heat's turned up on the element or the gas ring, and before it knows it, the lobster's cooked. That's what we're facing with climate. From day to day, we'll get a news event about a bad weather event here, there, or somewhere. There are many of them. But we don't notice the growing frequency of extreme events. We don't react to that in a way. And then whenever governments propose measures that might help to mitigate locally and globally, of course, every vested interest has a view on that. You watch current government and the Climate Commission in New Zealand struggle with that. I recall when I was Prime Minister, there was a survey at one point and it said to New Zealanders, do you think the government should do something about climate change? Well, in New Zealand, people think the government should do something about everything. So they say, yes, the government should do something. And then the survey went through the specifics of what should it do. So would you be prepared to pay more for your petrol? Oh, no. So this is the challenge, isn't it? To get people to see the bigger picture here, that it's not like, the roof's going to fall in tomorrow. But if we continue globally to head towards a 2.9 degree global warming scenario, and not the 1.5 aspirational target to keep it below Paris, which we're pretty close to exceeding, the world is not going to be much of a place for today's grandchildren, great-grandchildren to live in. And for the Pacific, with the many low-lying atolls, it's a question of existence. So it is serious. And again, it can be a role for inquiry for Auditors-General also to look at, are governments calculating the longer-term risks? Is is government policy and strategy properly risk informed? Are the right investments being made? Are they cost effective? I think these are all very legitimate areas for inquiry.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, certainly in big sectors like electricity or any infrastructure really, they're long-term investments, and people making decisions now play out for 50, 70, 100 years sometimes. And if we're not making those right decisions now, if governments aren't considering those sort of questions as they make investments now, then we're stuck. We've got either stranded assets or issues going into the future as well. We have invited others for questions. I don't know if Sarah's picked up any on the way through, but one thought from me that just because of who you are and all the things you've done is in your mind, if you were to be an Auditor-General in at some future aspiration that you might have, that was meant to be a joke. Didn't come across like one, but it was meant to be. What would be on your mind as a Pacific Auditor-General? What would be the sorts of things we've talked about? Obviously, resilience and the challenges of countries focusing on those risks. But what would be the sorts of things on your mind that you would turn your mind to?
Well, I think from my experience in public life in New Zealand and then at UNDP and then taking on some of these other roles in more recent years, the issue of risk-informed decision-making, I think, is absolutely critical. There's a Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and the negotiation of that and the attendance at the big conference in Sendai, Japan in 2015, it tends to be very focused on civil defence ministries. But the idea of systemic resilience goes far, far further than that. It needs whole of government approaches. Are the investments we're making risk-informed by climate, risk-informed by disease threat, risk-informed by whatever the risks on the horizon? So I think it's very important to be encouraging governments to do this horizon scan of the risks out there, and how are your policy frameworks and your investments fit for dealing with those risks. You made a point earlier about the importance of doing reviews of this pandemic experience, for example, and I think after any major catastrophic event like this, doing no holds bars reviews is very, very important, because there are lessons learned. Our own country is believed to have done reasonably well internationally, but not everything can't. We didn't have information. So what can we learn going back through the entrails of everything that happened? If we'd had perfect hindsight, what would we have done better? How would that feed into our planning for the future? So I think encouraging this risk-informed lens, learning from real life examples, also learning from how others have handled it. I think this is a very important lens to keep on public policy and investments.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems, the challenges, if you like, that Auditors-General have is limited resources. This isn't a late budget bid making, but and there's so much in your face at any one time as an Auditor-General that you could look at, that you feel you've got attention to. And I think that challenge you've talked about, the sort of what have we learned from the past, and are those lessons actually in place for the future so we don't have to relearn them? I think we're one of the few agencies, certainly in this country and probably around the world in the Pacific area, where we can actually take that longer term view and be reminding governments of commitments made or challenges they've got that they haven't planned for. It is always hard, though, to get the urgency on those that we'd all like to see. But I think it's not that ministers and governments don't want to do that. It's just they are faced with the same challenge of the immediate versus the important. Versus the important. It's been a real, a challenge going into the future. And I think particularly at a time like this, when governments have invested heavily to maintain economic activity and people's well-being, that really there are risks that countries could have absorbed You talked about sort of second world countries who don't get the same attention earlier. You know, there was resilience in the system, which I think COVID is now drained, really, and probably all countries, but certainly in those that were vulnerable or less well off to begin with.
Yeah,
and I think that challenge here is good.
Yeah, you know, there was a lessons learned done in New Zealand after the SARS epidemic, which happened when I was PM and clearly didn't affect us much because I can barely remember anything about it. It came out of the lessons learned that we needed, you know, to have legislation. And if you go back and look, 2006, the Epidemic Preparedness Act was passed as one of the, you know, points that came out of reviewing that experience. So I think it, and probably that now needs to be looked at as well to see whether it was up to the task of this pandemic. But certainly, you know, we went into the pandemic better for having it than for not having it. So those are very, very vital lessons to be learned. Look, a huge lesson globally is that where there isn't social safety nets or what we call universal social protection, it's been very hard to have effective public health measures, because where you have societies largely comprised of subsistence growers and sellers and traders, if you lock down, there's no food to put on the table. And the most basic universal social security or safety net becomes extremely important. I imagine this is something Fiji is wrestling with at the moment. You know, how broad is cash transfer schemes in Fiji? Lockdown, I guess, because of the fear on those who live on subsistence. So, you know, we need to think quite broadly about preparedness and think of those kinds of policies that are vital too.
We had done a review earlier last year on in the middle of the lockdown on our own personal protective equipment, particularly looking at masks, and that reflected on the work that had been done to prepare. You know, and there had been quite a lot of scenario planning around a flu-like epidemic or pandemic. Of course, we did find some issues. You know, there was a period of activity, and then we move on, and so, you know, national stocks hadn't been maintained and a few other things. So it just shows that constant vigilance and rehearsing. Sarah here has got a question, and then I think we're probably coming to a close.
Yes, yeah, we've got about 2.5 minutes to go in the session. Perhaps just to take it back to PASAI heads, the question is, what do you think PASAI heads could or should do to build the most favourable response or respect from the systems that they're working within?
Well, I think having the public on side helps. And my recollection in New Zealand, the General's kind of emerges the heroes of the day taking on governments. So I think there is a role with communicating with the public, so the public understands the role, and that there's broad support for the role of holding, you know, those who hold power and spend public money to account. So that would be my tip. Don't be sort of, you know, shrinking violets who are, you know, the sort of unseen men and women who in, you know, sort of offices, you know, somewhere in a multi-story building and not connected with reality. No, you know, vital integrity institutions that the public should know about. So I think, you know, some outreach strategies could be quite helpful in building support for the institutions. And of course, you know, I mean, you have the regular interface with the parliaments and your systems and so on. That's important too. And parliaments generally will be respectful to Auditors General, officers of Parliament, I think, even in our own system.
Great.
All right. Thank you. I'm not sure if you can see, Helen, the discussion forum, but we've had many comments about how insightful and helpful and interesting your reflections have been, and how helpful for both us in our current roles, but as a Congress, thinking about the future and leadership roles. Enormous challenges. I'm not sure if other Auditors General have had an opportunity to read the WHO report, which name I have to write down again, Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. But I encourage everybody to read it. I think if you could have one thing out of this meeting, that all Auditors-General read it and consider what they could do to encourage action on it, I'm sure you'd appreciate that. It's an excellent report and also an excellent communication tool. It's accessible to anyone who wants and has an interest, wants to read it, has an interest in the subject, which I'm sure we all do. So look, I can't thank you enough, but I do say thank you very much for your time. You've been extraordinarily busy. It's been great to have you here. I know we had a bit of connection problem at the beginning, but it's been a great conversation. Very much appreciated by all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. All the best for the rest of the Congress.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks.